All right, let's go. Number 10, Nabta Playa. Deep in the Nubian desert, roughly 800 kilometers south of Cairo, sits a stretch of land so hostile that an anthropologist crossing it in 1974 almost walked past the most important discovery of his career. Fred Wendorf was returning from a survey in Libya when his team noticed an unusual arrangement of stones half buried in the sand. What they had found was a circle of upright slabs, barely 4 meters across, built by people who had no writing, no metal tools, and no permanent cities. The circle contains 29 stones, a number that corresponds closely to the days of a lunar month. Radiocarbon dating on nearby burial mounds, where the same people interred cattle in clay-lined pits, places activity at the site between roughly 5500 and 4900 BC. Later analysis by astronomer J. McKim Malville placed the erection of the circle itself closer to 4800 BC, oriented so that 2 pairs of stones mark a north-south line and 2 others mark the point on the horizon where the sun rises at the summer solstice. That solstice mattered because it did not simply mark a change of season here. It marked the point in the year when, if the monsoon still held, the region's shallow lakes would begin to refill. Some researchers, most notably astrophysicist Thomas Brophy, have proposed a far more ambitious reading of the site, that the taller central stones represent the stars of Orion's belt and shoulders, forming a kind of star map precise enough to record the slow drift of the sky across thousands of years. A 2007 University of Colorado study challenged Brophy's specific dating, finding his proposed alignments did not hold up under closer scrutiny. The calendar function tied to the solstice and the rains is on far steadier ground. Here is where the mystery sharpens. Nabta Playa was not built during a stable climate. It was built as the eastern Sahara was drying out from underneath the people who lived there. The green savanna that had supported cattle herders for 2,000 years was failing, the monsoon retreating south year by year, the region's lakes shrinking toward the desert that occupies the same ground today. Getting the calendar right was not a ceremonial exercise for its own sake. It was the difference between knowing when to move a herd toward water while water could still be found, and losing that herd, and the people depending on it, to a landscape that was actively turning against them. Wendorf's team, part of the long-running combined prehistoric expedition, had already spent years mapping seasonal camps across the eastern Sahara before the calendar circle itself came into focus. Nearby, in what researchers call the Valley of Sacrifices, they found clay-lined pits containing the remains of cattle, animals that had been deliberately interred rather than simply butchered, suggesting a population whose identity and ritual life were built around their herds. Further megalithic structures continued to be raised around the site until roughly 3600 BC, expanding the complex well beyond the original circle. By around 3400 BC, the people of Nabta Playa were gone. The site was abandoned as the surrounding basin dried into true desert, its wells failing one after another. Some researchers argue that this migration pushed surviving populations north towards the Nile, feeding into the cultural foundations that would, centuries later, give rise to dynastic Egypt. The stone circle they left behind still stands in the open sand, tilted now by thousands of years of wind, still pointed at a solstice sunrise, still marking the beginning of a rainy season that no longer arrives. Number 9. The field that measured the moon before anyone had learned to write. In the summer of 1976, an unusually hot, dry season baked the fields of Aberdeenshire, Scotland, and pulled strange markings up through the parched crops near Craith's Castle. Aerial photographs taken by the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland recorded the marks, but their meaning sat unexamined for almost 30 years. In 2004, the National Trust for Scotland finally excavated the site, known as Warren Field, and found a curving arc of 12 pits, cut into the earth roughly 10,000 years ago. Radiocarbon dating placed the pits in the 8th millennium BC, built not by farmers, but by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. People who left behind no pottery, no permanent villages, no crops. A team led by Professor Vince Gaffney of the University of Birmingham, working with Dr. Richard Bates of the University of St. Andrews, published a detailed analysis in 2013 arguing that the 12 pits were shaped and spaced to track the changing phases of the moon across a full year, functioning as the earliest known calendar anywhere on Earth. No comparable structure has been found anywhere else in Britain or Europe for thousands of years after Warren Field was built, which leaves it standing alone in the archaeological record rather than as one example among several. What makes this significant is not simply its age. It is the correction built into it. A lunar year drifts against the solar year by roughly 11 days annually, and left uncorrected, a purely lunar calendar slides out of alignment with the actual seasons within a few years. The Warren Field arc also points toward the midwinter sunrise on the horizon, a fixed solar marker that would have let its builders reset the count and pull their lunar calendar back into sync with the true turning of the year. This is a calendar with a built-in fix for its own error, designed by people who had not yet invented the plow. The safer conclusion, and the one the researchers themselves emphasize, is that this device predates the first formal calendars known from Mesopotamia by nearly 5,000 years. That timeline forces a reconsideration of what hunter-gatherer societies were actually capable of tracking, and why. For groups without stored grain, missing the return of migrating game, a salmon run, or the ripening of a specific plant, by even a few weeks, could mean the difference between a manageable winter and a fatal one. A calendar this precise was not a luxury of leisure. It was an early defense against the oldest catastrophe a small human group can face, which is simply running out of time to prepare. The 12 pits themselves hold a further oddity. They are not identical. Each is a slightly different size, with the smallest two positioned at either end of the arc, and none contain the remains of an actual wooden post. Only burnt material and stones that appear to have been carried in from some distance away. Researchers studying comparable Mesolithic sites across Britain, including seasonal gathering grounds like Starcar in Yorkshire, have found growing evidence that hunter-gatherer groups organized their movements around the calendar rather than the other way around, planning seasonal reunions and resource use with a level of foresight not usually credited to societies without permanent settlements. The pits at Warren Field were filled in long ago. Whether by the builders or by the passage of centuries is not entirely clear, and no wooden post survives inside any of them today. The arc itself remains, cut into a Scottish hillside, the shape of a calculation whose precise method of transmission from one generation of hunter-gatherers to the next is still not fully understood. Number 8. Chankillo. For most of the 20th century, explorers who came across the ruins at Chankillo on the north coast of Peru assumed they were looking at a fort. The hilltop complex has thick, triple-layered walls, narrow gated entrances, and a long ridge lined with 13 squared stone towers that archaeologists nicknamed the Norelco Ruin for its resemblance to an electric shaver. For decades, that military reading held, even though the fort had no water source inside it, and an unusual number of gates for a defensive structure. In 2007, Peruvian archaeologist Ivan Gezi and British archaeoastronomer Clive Ruggles proposed something different. Working from two observation points flanking the towers to the east and west, they showed that the 13 towers form an artificial jagged horizon that exactly spans the sun's rising and setting arc across the year. Standing at either platform, an observer would always see the sun rise or set behind one of the towers, and the specific tower marked the date to within 2 or 3 days, across the entire solar year, not just at a single solstice. The site itself dates to around the 3rd century BC, making it the oldest known solar observatory in the Americas, predating the sun tracking practices of the Inca by close to 2,000 years. Dendrochronological and radiocarbon samples secured the timeline. The towers themselves vary from roughly 70 to 130 meters wide, spaced between 4 and 5 meters apart, and originally stood with flat tops, their outer walls once finished in bright white plaster and decorated with painted figures, now almost entirely weathered away. Excavations also turned up warrior figurines and sling stones, confirming that Chankillo's builders lived with a real and immediate threat of conflict, not an abstract one. In late 2025, further excavation beneath the towers uncovered traces of even older structures with their own apparent astronomical orientation, along with a previously unrecorded corridor, aligned to track the moon rather than the sun. That find suggests skywatching at this site began earlier than the observatory that made it famous, and that whoever built the earlier structures was already coordinating both solar and lunar observation long before the 13 towers were raised. Viewed from a distance, the line of towers running along the ridge has been compared by researchers to the vertebrae of a spine, and paired staircases and repeated step motifs found throughout the complex point to a concept of duality that recurs across Andean architecture and pottery of the period, long before the Inca made the same symbolism famous. Interest in the site is not new, though its protection has not always kept pace with that interest. Peruvian archaeologist Rosa Fung and conservator Victor Pimentel had drafted early conservation plans for the complex as far back as the 1960s, decades before its astronomical function was recognized. And more recently, agricultural development in the surrounding valley has posed a direct threat to the towers themselves. The site was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2021, formal recognition arriving nearly 2,300 years after the towers were first raised. What makes this different from a simple fort or a simple calendar is that it was clearly built to be both at once. A society organizing its planting, its harvest, and its rituals down to a matter of days, while simultaneously fortifying a hilltop against attack, was a society for whom precision and survival were the same problem. The 13 towers still stand along their ridge in the coastal desert, a stone instrument built to hold two functions that modern visitors tend to separate: the discipline of measuring time and the discipline of staying alive long enough to use it. Number 7. The temple that still finds its own door. On the southern coast of Malta stands a temple complex called Mnajdra, its concave stone facade leading through a narrow trilithon doorway into a sequence of inner chambers. To a visitor walking through on an ordinary afternoon, it looks like any other weathered Neolithic ruin, its limestone blocks softened by 5,000 years of salt air. Nothing about the entrance suggests it was built to do anything but keep out the wind. Twice a year, at the spring and autumn equinox, that changes. At sunrise, a narrow blade of light enters through the main doorway, travels the full length of the temple's central axis, and lands precisely on the innermost niche at the back of the building. On the day, the niche is lit. Off the day, it is not. Archaeologist David Trump, who spent decades studying Malta's temple culture, called the alignment no accident. At the summer and winter solstices, a second effect takes over. The first rays of the rising sun graze the edge of a single decorated megalith just inside the doorway. On one side of the stone at midsummer, the opposite side at midwinter, researchers Frank Ventura and George Agius confirmed the equinox alignment through detailed survey work published in 2017, and archaeoastronomer Torre Lomsdalen has documented the same behavior across multiple observing seasons. The temple was raised sometime between roughly 3600 and 2500 BC, using stone blocks weighing up to 20 tons, without metal tools, without the wheel, by a population confined to a small Mediterranean island with no comparable cities anywhere nearby. The temple's concave facade opens onto a curved forecourt lined with stone benches, suggesting the equinox and solstice events were witnessed by a gathered community rather than a single observer working alone. Nearby, the linked temple of Hagar Chim adds a further layer, a hole in one wall, sometimes called an oracle hole, that researchers believe tracked a stellar cycle spanning roughly 18 years, in addition to its own alignment toward the summer solstice sunrise. Together, the two sites imply a solar and lunar calendar built into architecture, marking every major turning point in the year with light instead of writing. Because Malta's temple builders left almost no trace of their everyday domestic life, these buildings and the heavy, corpulent stone figures of a seated woman found inside them and at related sites across the islands remain the clearest window into what this culture believed. Researchers generally read the figures as evidence of a fertility cult bound up with the same cycles of sun, season, and renewal. The temples were built to track, though, as with so much about this vanished society, the deeper meaning behind the ritual can only be inferred from what stone alone was able to preserve. But here's where the story reverses on itself. The same people who tracked the sky with this precision, who could not have miscalculated an equinox by even a day without the failure showing up in stone, vanished by around 2500 BC. Excavated burials from the Brocktorf Circle on nearby Gozo show a population whose teeth and bones grew progressively worse over the centuries. A sign, researchers argue, of soil exhaustion and declining nutrition rather than any sudden violence. No burned layer, no evidence of conquest, points to an outside enemy. The competing explanations, deforestation, drought, disease, remain genuinely unresolved among researchers, and no single one commands full agreement. What is agreed is that the islands stood largely empty for roughly a century afterward, and that the culture which eventually resettled Malta in the Bronze Age arrived with an entirely different way of life, disposing of its dead by cremation rather than continuing the temple-building tradition it replaced. What Mnajdra leaves behind, then, is a strange asymmetry. A civilization capable of reading the heavens with total accuracy could not read the slower, quieter catastrophe unfolding on their own island, the one made of overused soil and vanishing trees, until it was already too late to stop. The temple still catches the equinox light every year, on schedule, for an audience that no longer exists to receive it. Number 6. The circle that is either an observatory or a graveyard. On a windswept promontory above the town of Sicyon in southern Armenia stand 223 stones of black basalt, some of them weighing up to 10 tons, arranged in a rough circle with 2 long arms extending outward. Dozens of the stones have holes bored clean through them, drilled at different angles, and on a windy day the holes make the whole hillside whistle and hum. The local name, Karahunge, is usually translated as speaking stones, though the site is also known in Armenian as Zoretz Karar, meaning army of stones, a name drawn from older folklore that pictured the megaliths as a petrified military formation. Burial cists uncovered among the stones only deepen the puzzle, since a graveyard and an observatory are not functions that obviously belong together. The site was first proposed as an astronomical installation in 1984 by Armenian researcher Onik Kankikyan, followed a year later by a formal hypothesis from astrophysicist Elma Parsamian of the Bayrakhan Observatory, who extended her analysis to 2 further megalithic sites in the region, Metzamor and Angegakot, arguing that all 3 formed part of a wider tradition of prehistoric skywatching across the Armenian highlands. The most extensive investigation came from radiophysicist Paris Harouni, whose survey work between 1994 and 2001 concluded that Karahunge was, in his assessment, the world's oldest astronomical observatory, with some alignments he dated to as early as the 6th millennium BC. Harouni proposed that specific stones tracked the star Deneb in the constellation Cygnus, and drew a direct comparison to the carved pillars found at Gobekli Tepe in Turkey. In 1999, the American archaeoastronomer Gerald Hawkins, known for his earlier analysis of Stonehenge, reviewed Harouni's calculations and reportedly praised their precision in a personal letter. Not everyone agrees. A team of archaeologists from the University of Munich, publishing in 2000, concluded that Karahunge functioned mainly as a Middle Bronze Age to Iron Age necropolis, its stones marking graves rather than stars, and suggested it may also have served as a fortified refuge during periods of conflict. Archaeoastronomer Clive Ruggles has been openly skeptical of the more sweeping claims, noting that direct comparisons to Stonehenge, a monument few specialists now consider to have functioned as an observatory either, are less useful than they first appear. Some of the specific stone-to-star alignments proposed at Karahunge have also failed to hold up under later, more rigorous survey. The disagreement has never fully resolved. In 2004, the Armenian government officially renamed the site the Karahunge Observatory. By parliamentary decree, even as archaeologists in the same country continued to argue that it was first and foremost a burial ground. At one point, researchers on both sides of the dispute reportedly agreed to pause independent work and pursue a joint study, bringing astronomers, archaeoastronomers, archaeologists, and ethnographers together in an attempt to settle the question once and for all. That combined effort has not produced a final answer. Whatever function the site's builders intended, the wind still finds the drilled holes in the stones today, exactly as it has for however many thousands of years those holes have existed, and answers with the same sound regardless of which side of the argument happens to be listening. Number 5. The disk that was sold before it was studied. On the 4th of July in 1999, two men working the Mittelberg Hill near the German town of Nebra with metal detectors got a signal. Henry Westphal and Mario Renner dug into the topsoil with picks and spades and pulled out a bronze disc inlaid with gold, along with 2 bronze swords, 2 axes, a chisel, and a pair of arm spirals. The following day, they sold the entire hoard to a dealer in Cologne for 31,000 Deutschmarks. Over the next 2 years, it changed hands repeatedly on the black market, at one point fetching nearly $1 million. By 2001, word of the disc's existence had leaked into public knowledge. Harold Meller, the newly appointed state archaeologist of Saxony-Anhalt, arranged a sting operation, and in February 2002, he met a couple in the lobby of a Basel hotel, posing as a buyer. The man produced the disc from beneath his shirt, where he had taped it to his stomach to smuggle it across the Swiss border. Under German law, finds of this kind belonged to the state, and the 2 original looters were eventually sentenced in a Naumburg court to 4 and 10 months respectively, sentences that were increased on appeal to 6 and 12 months. Scientific dating placed the object at roughly 1600 BC, part of the early Bronze Age Unitas culture, and trace analysis on the gold matched it to sources in Cornwall, thousands of kilometers away. The disc itself is a plate of bronze about 30 centimeters across and just over 2 kilograms in weight, its surface patinated blue-green, showing a gold sun or full moon, a crescent moon, and a cluster of 32 small stars, 7 of which are grouped in a pattern researchers identify as the Pleiades. 2 gold arcs were added to its edges later, spanning an angle that matches the separation between summer and winter solstice sunsets, at that latitude precisely. A final gold arc was added at the bottom of the disc afterwards still, covered in fine parallel strokes whose meaning remains genuinely unresolved, with different researchers reading it as a solar barge, a rendering of the Milky Way, or a rainbow. What makes the object more than decoration is a separate, better supported detail. The crescent moon sits directly beside the star cluster in the exact configuration used, according to an intercalation rule recorded centuries later in the Babylonian text, known as Ma'el-Apien, to signal that a leap month needed to be added to keep a lunar calendar in step with the solar year. Without that correction, a purely lunar calendar drifts against the true seasons by about 11 days annually. Left unchecked for even a handful of years, a farming community's planting and harvest dates slip badly out of alignment with the weather that actually governs them, risking a harvest cut short by frost, or a planting drowned by rain that arrived earlier than expected. The disc appears to encode, in gold and bronze, the exact fix for that drift, roughly 1,000 years before the same rule appears in writing on the other side of the ancient world. A small number of critics have suggested the whole object might be a modern forgery, but soil residue matching the burial site and metallurgical testing on the bronze and gold have left little support for that claim among researchers who have examined it directly. The discovery site itself sits inside a much older prehistoric hilltop enclosure in the Ziegelrode forest, an area already marked by close to 1,000 burial mounds by the time the disc was buried there. That the gold in a calendar device buried in central Germany can be traced back to Cornwall implies a trade network already stretching across a significant part of Bronze Age Europe, one capable of moving both raw materials and, evidently, precise astronomical knowledge across enormous distances long before anyone in the region could write a word of it down. The disk now rests behind glass in the State Museum of Prehistory in Halle, the marks of a looter's pick still visible across its surface, alongside evidence of a calendar correction that may once have stood between a Bronze Age village and a winter it could not survive. Number 4. The star that painted itself onto a canyon wall. On the 4th of July in the year 1054, a star appeared in the pre-dawn sky that had not been there the night before. Chinese and Japanese court astronomers recorded a guest star bright enough to be seen in broad daylight, reaching close to 10 times the brightness of Venus, and visible for roughly 3 weeks before it faded from naked eye view. What those observers were watching, without knowing it, was the death of a star roughly 6,500 light-years away, an explosion so violent that its expanding remnant, the Crab Nebula, is still visible through telescopes today. At the same moment, in what is now northwestern New Mexico, the ancestral Puebloan people were in the middle of constructing a great house called Penasco Blanco, part of the wider complex known as Chaco Canyon, its construction spanning roughly 900 to 1125 CE. On the underside of a rock shelf below the West Mesa, sheltered from centuries of wind and rain, someone painted 3 symbols: a 10-pointed star, a crescent moon, and a human handprint. The panel was first proposed in 1955 as a possible eyewitness record of the 1054 event, and by the late 1970s, researchers had cataloged at least 20 other candidate sites across the American Southwest showing similar star and crescent combinations, including a painted pot from the Mimbres Valley showing a star at the foot of a crescent-shaped rabbit, a figure tied in regional tradition to the moon itself. The case for this specific panel rests on orientation. The moon and Earth return to almost exactly the same relative position, roughly every 18.5 years, which has allowed researchers modeling the sky above that exact cliff to reconstruct the view with real precision. What they found is that the position of the painted star relative to the crescent matches closely the pre-dawn arrangement of the supernova and the moon as they would have appeared on the morning of July 5th, 1054. A faint sun symbol on the same rock face suggests the location doubled as a point for observing sunrise, meaning whoever was watching the horizon that morning may simply have been the first to notice something new burning where nothing had burned before. A second, fainter pictograph on a nearby vertical face has been read by some as a possible depiction of Halley's Comet, which passed through the inner solar system just 12 years later in 1066. Though that identification is considerably less secure than the supernova panel itself. The interpretation is far from settled. E.C. Krupp, director of the Griffith Observatory, spent decades personally re-examining the primary southwest sites associated with this theory, and concluded flatly that star and crescent imagery in this region has nothing to do with the 1054 event, arguing that such symbols carry different meanings across different cultures and periods. Researchers remain divided, and no consensus has closed the question either way. What is not in dispute is the underlying event itself, a real stellar catastrophe, bright enough to be seen without instruments across multiple continents at once, its remnants still expanding outward nearly 1,000 years later. It is also not in dispute that the 11th century, the same period this pictograph was painted in, marked the height of what archaeologists call the Chaco phenomenon, a period of extraordinary construction and regional influence across the canyon that would, within another century, collapse amid a prolonged and severe drought, scattering the population that built Penasco Blanco and its neighboring great houses. If the panel is what some believe it to be, it stands as one of the only surviving human testimonies of a genuine astronomical catastrophe from a culture that otherwise left no written record at all, painted by people whose own society was, unknowingly, entering the early stages of an entirely different kind of collapse. The painting remains exactly where it was placed, protected under its stone overhang and marked today by a small sign reading simply supernova, holding a claim that may never be proven and has so far also never been disproven. Number 3, Callanish. On the Isle of Lewis, in Scotland's Outer Hebrides, a ring of standing stones rises from a remote hillside overlooking Loch Rogue. 13 stones form the central circle surrounding a monolith of Lewisian gneiss, rock roughly 3 billion years old and among the oldest on the planet, that stands nearly 5 meters tall. From this circle, stone rows extend outward in the shape of a cross, one to the east, one to the south, one to the west, and the longest running north for close to 80 meters as a double avenue. Building a monument on this scale on a remote, windswept, and sparsely fertile island made little practical sense for a farming community, which only sharpens the question of why Neolithic labor was spent raising it here, rather than somewhere more forgiving. The site was raised around 2900 BC, centuries before the great sarcens of Stonehenge were set upright. Roughly every 18.5 years, something happens here that most people alive today will witness only 2 or 3 times in their lifetime. The moon completes a longer cycle, known as a major lunar standstill, rising and setting at its most extreme points on the horizon. At Callanish, during that standstill, the full moon rises low over a distant range of hills that, from this exact vantage point, forms the silhouette of a reclining human figure, known locally as Cailleach na Mointeach, the Old Woman of the Moors. The moon appears to travel along her outline before disappearing into the northern avenue of stones. Early survey work by engineer Alexander Thom in the 20th century, building on earlier observations by Gerald Hawkins, first proposed that the stone rows functioned as sightlines rather than a purely ceremonial arrangement, and later detailed observation by researchers Margaret Curtis, Gerald Ponting, and Ron Curtis confirmed the alignment across repeated cycles. Some researchers have proposed that around 2450 BC, the site's builders added the northern avenue specifically to frame this lunar event, shifting the monument's emphasis from the sun toward the moon. Whether the site also served as a ritual gathering space, a route for ceremonial processions, or some combination of all three remains debated, since the cruciform layout supports more than one interpretation at once. An event that returns only once every 18.5 years cannot be learned by simple observation and memory alone. It has to be deliberately taught, passed from one generation to the next, long before anyone at Callanish could write the knowledge down. Clive Ruggles, among others in the field, has cautioned that lunar standstill alignments are an active and sometimes contested area of research, and that enthusiasm for finding them has occasionally outpaced the evidence supporting any one specific site. In much later Gaelic tradition, long after the stones themselves had fallen silent as a working instrument, the Cailleach reappears as a hag goddess associated with winter, storms, and the turning of the seasons, a figure said to control the hardship that comes with the year's dark half. Whether that later folklore reaches back in any real sense to the people who built the stones cannot be shown, and researchers are careful not to claim it as proof of anything. But the same hillside silhouette that the moon still traces once every 18.5 years carried, across thousands of years of retelling, an association with the season that could still kill a community that failed to prepare for it. The standstill is not a one-time event, but a recurring appointment written into the landscape itself. A major standstill was recorded here in 2006, a minor standstill followed in 2015, and the moon returned to trace the same outline again in 2025, exactly as it has on this same 18.5-year rhythm, since long before anyone at Callanish had a written word to record what they had seen. Number 2, the cave that may hold the oldest sky chart on Earth. In September of 1940, 4 teenagers in the Dordogne region of France, led by 18-year-old Marcel Ravidat, followed their dog Robot down a hole left by an uprooted tree and slid into a cave chamber covered floor to ceiling in painted animals. What they had found, entirely by accident, was Lascaux, a gallery of Ice Age art roughly 17,000 years old. Word reached the prehistorian Henri Breuil, who visited within days and confirmed the paintings were genuine rather than a hoax, setting off decades of study. Deep within the cave, reachable only by a vertical drop, lies a smaller chamber known as the Shaft of the Dead Man, containing a scene unlike anything else on the walls. A stick figure man with the head of a bird, apparently falling or reclining beside a disemboweled bison, with a bird perched on a nearby staff, and a woolly rhinoceros walking away in the opposite direction. In 1997, astronomer Michael Rappengluck proposed that the eyes of the bull, the birdman, and the bird correspond to three of the sky's brightest stars, Vega, Deneb, and Altair, together forming the pattern modern astronomers call the Summer Triangle, a group that during the last ice age would have remained visible above this latitude's horizon all year round. Separately, in the cave's main gallery, the Hall of the Bulls, researcher Luz Antequera Congregado proposed in a 1992 doctoral thesis, later supported by independent work from other researchers, that a cluster of painted dots above one large bull corresponds to the Pleiades star cluster, with additional dots marking the neighboring Hyades, both located within the constellation Taurus, whose brightest star, Aldebaran, is still known today as the Bullseye. Under skies with no artificial light anywhere on the horizon, the Pleiades would have appeared far more vivid to an Ice Age observer than they do to almost anyone alive now. Bright enough that a careful painter, working from memory, could plausibly have reproduced their exact shape. What makes this significant is not only that Ice Age hunter-gatherers may have painted what they saw overhead. It is a far more speculative claim built on top of that observation. Engineer Martin Sweatman, applying the same animal-to-constellation method he previously used on the Vulture Stone at Gobekli Tepe in Turkey, has argued that the shaft seen at Lascaux can be decoded using an identical system, potentially linking it to the same disputed Younger Dryas comet hypothesis discussed elsewhere in this list. The specific dates Sweatman's method produces for different animal pairings in this scene do not fully agree with one another, and the broader claim rests on an assumption that most archaeologists do not accept, that the symbolic meaning of an animal as constellation stayed fixed across many thousands of years in completely unrelated cultures, separated by a continent. The safer conclusion, shared even by many researchers skeptical of the wider theory, is that the Pleiades and Hyades correspondence in the Hall of the Bulls remains a credible and intriguing possibility. While the cross-site comet code proposed for the shaft scene specifically is considered highly speculative and is not accepted by the archaeological mainstream. Some scholars of comparative mythology have separately noted that the bird-headed man and his bull recall a far later legend, found in versions across India, Persia, and Scandinavia, of a first ancestor whose body gives rise to the world, though any direct link between that myth and this particular painting remains, at best, an intriguing parallel rather than a demonstrated connection. What can be said without dispute is this: whatever the shaft scene does or does not encode, it survives from almost exactly the period when the last Ice Age's warming trend broke, plunging the world back into more than 1,000 years of renewed cold known as the Younger Dryas, an abrupt climate reversal whose cause remains one of the most contested questions in Earth science. The cave has been sealed to the public since 1963, closed off after the breath and body heat of visitors began growing algae and damaging the paint. A full-scale replica, built nearby to let the public see the paintings without endangering them further, now receives the visitors the original cave no longer can. The shaft of the dead man itself sits in permanent, protected darkness, holding whatever message, real or projected onto it by later minds, its Ice Age painters intended to leave behind. Number 1. The hill its own builders chose to bury. In 1963, a joint survey team from the University of Chicago and the University of Istanbul walked across a hill in southeastern Turkey that local people called Gobekli Tepe, meaning Potbelly Hill. They noted broken limestone slabs scattered across the surface and concluded, reasonably enough for a region full of ruins, that the mound was nothing more than a Byzantine-era cemetery, unremarkable and not worth further study. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt returned to the site and recognized what the earlier survey had missed. The slabs were the tops of buried, T-shaped megalithic pillars, some still standing where they had been raised thousands of years earlier. Excavation revealed multiple circular stone enclosures, pillars over 5 meters tall and weighing many tons, carved with foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, and vultures. Several of the pillars are shaped with subtle arms and hands carved along their sides, folded toward a belt-like band at the base, giving the T-shape an unmistakably human silhouette, despite carrying no facial features at all. Radiocarbon dating placed construction at roughly 9600s BC, making Gobekli Tepe the oldest known monumental architecture anywhere on Earth, built some 6,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt or the great stones of Stonehenge, by people who had no metal tools, no pottery, and, as far as current evidence shows, no agriculture yet either. Coordinating the labor to quarry, carve, and raise stones this size, with nothing but stone tools and rope, already forced a rethinking of what hunter-gatherer societies were capable of organizing. The traditional assumption in archaeology had long been the reverse order: agriculture and settled village life first, monumental religious architecture only afterward, once a surplus of stored food could free up labor for anything else. Gobekli Tepe appears to invert that sequence entirely, raising the possibility that the gathering of large groups for shared ritual construction came first, and that farming followed as a consequence of feeding the crowds such construction required, rather than the other way around. A related site nearby, Karahunge, discovered more recently, has since produced comparable pillars and carvings, suggesting Gobekli Tepe was not an isolated achievement, but part of a wider network of monumental sites built across the same region and period. Then came a second layer of evidence, one that is not seriously disputed by any excavator who has worked the site. Several of the oldest enclosures were not simply abandoned to time. They were deliberately filled in, buried under tons of rubble and sediment, by the very people who had built and used them, sealing the carved pillars underground where they remained hidden for roughly 11,000 years, until Schmidt's team uncovered them again. At the center of the site's deepest controversy sits Pillar 43, in Enclosure D, nicknamed the Vulture Stone for its dense carving of birds, a scorpion, and a headless human figure. In 2017, Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Sakritsis of the University of Edinburgh proposed matching these carved animals to star constellations, arguing the pillar functions as a date stamp for approximately 10,950 BC, a figure that lines up closely with the proposed onset of the Younger Dryas, an abrupt, nearly 1,200-year return to Ice Age cold that interrupted the natural warming at the end of the last glacial period. Proponents of the broader Younger Dryas impact hypothesis argue this cooling was triggered by a fragmented comet or asteroid strike, pointing to unusual concentrations of platinum and melted, glass-like material found in sediment layers of the same age on multiple continents. Schmidt's own excavation team published a direct response, questioning whether ancient symbolic animals can be assumed to represent the same fixed constellations across such an enormous span of time, and disputing several of the specific animal-to-star matches proposed on the pillar. The wider scientific reception of the impact hypothesis itself remains unresolved, with critics noting that decades of published evidence across geology, chemistry, and paleoclimatology have not converged into a single, coherent, testable scenario. A follow-up paper in 2024 extended the same method to argue that a separate carving at the site functions as a full calendar, system tracking days and months, a claim that drew wide, largely uncritical media coverage, even as specialists in the field again called the underlying interpretation highly speculative and insufficiently supported by the carvings themselves. The safer and more widely supported reading remains that Gobekli Tepe's carvings reflect a symbolic or religious system whose full meaning is lost, not necessarily a literal record of any specific comet. Two things remain true, regardless of which side of that argument eventually wins. A real climate catastrophe, still debated in its cause but not in its existence, genuinely interrupted the end of the Ice Age around this time, plunging a warming world back into more than a millennium of hardship. And separately, the people of Gobekli Tepe, whoever they were and whatever their carvings meant to them, built the largest ritual structures their culture had ever attempted, and then, deliberately, with their own hands, buried them. Geophysical surveys show that dozens more of these T-shaped pillars remain sealed beneath the unexcavated portions of the hill today, exactly where their builders chose to leave them. The first known instance of humanity raising something this permanent, and, in the same breath, the first known instance of humanity deciding it needed to be hidden again. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.